It's a great pleasure to introduce my friend, Daniel Ackermann. Daniel is Chief Curator and Director of Collections, Research, and Archaeology at Old Salem Museum and Gardens and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, which we all know by the acronym MESDA. In his honor, I'm going to begin to don one of my props, a very special issue camouflage tricorn hat. I'm told here at Williamsburg, if our Army had had camouflage tricorn hats, we might have won the revolution a bit earlier. Daniel also directs the MESDA Summer Institute, which I had the privilege of doing in 1978, probably before he was born. It's a graduate level program partnership between the museum and the University of Virginia. And it was there that I met my present boss and colleague, Ron Hurst. Ackermann has curated a wide range of exhibits at the museum, including Black and White, All Mixed Together, The Hidden Legacy of Enslaved Craftsmen, and Our Spirited Ancestors, The Decorative Art of Drink. As curator of MESDA, Daniel has also managed the renovation and reinstallation of the museum's study galleries, and he oversaw the addition of 2 self-guided galleries. He serves as the American Secretary for the Regional Furniture Society of Great Britain. Daniel began his career at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where he was a Tiffany and Company Foundation curatorial intern in American Decorative Arts. He holds degrees from the College of William and Mary and the University of Virginia, and a PhD in art history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Today, he will speak to us on invisible patina, or patina if you prefer, family, history, memory, and mystery in Southern furniture. Daniel.
Hi, I'm Daniel Ackermann, Chief Curator at Old Salem Museums and Gardens and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I'm so glad that I can join you this afternoon live from the Carolyn and Mike McNamara Southern Masterworks Gallery in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I do hope you'll be able to visit us here in person as soon as you're able. Before I begin, I would like to thank our moderator, Tom Savage, as well as Jack Pruitt and the entire team at the Historic New Orleans Collection who've worked so tirelessly to make this year's forum possible. Today, I'd like to talk about a subject and a word that I think many of you all are familiar with. The word is patina. Now, when I say patina, what do you think about? If you're like many antique collectors and connoisseurs, you probably think about surface, color, depth, that kind of invisible something that makes an object truly special. If you're a fan of the Antiques Roadshow, you might think about patina in terms of what happens when you remove it. And you're informed that your family's priceless heirloom would have been worth $1 million, except for the fact that it was refinished, that it had its patina removed, and now it's worth nothing. My grandfather used to live for those moments in Antiques Roadshow, where the people crestfallen would realize that if Grandpa hadn't refinished it, hadn't removed the patina, the object would still be worth so much more. But I want to talk about a different kind of patina, an invisible patina, something that also adds meaning and depth and sometimes even monetary value, but certainly understanding to an object. This is a kind of patina that comes with history, use, and even sometimes a healthy dose of family lore. And I'd actually like to start very close to home, both for you, my New Orleans audience, but also for me and my own family. And I'd like to start with this story of a very personal object. This silver goblet was a gift, a wedding gift, to my great-great-grandparents when they married in Baden, Germany in 1881. And you can see the initials C, P, and M for Carl and Pauline Meyer. She was Pauline Adler. They married in 1881 and had a number of children. But in 1894, they left Germany and immigrated to New Orleans via New York on the Augusta Victoria from Hamburg, along with their children. Now, Carl was a cotton merchant. We can assume that's why he chose to move to New Orleans. And we can also assume that through his business and probably a shared membership in Touro Synagogue, Pauline and Carl's daughter, Melanie, met my great-grandfather, Percy Kaufman. Now, Percy's father was Charles A. Kaufman, who was a merchant who ran a successful business in New Orleans. Eventually, Kaufman and Isaacs would become Charles A. Kaufman and Company. And because much of their stock in trade was clothing, and because the Myers were in the cotton business, you can see it was sort of a match made in business heaven. Now, the cup passed from Pauline and Carl to Melanie and Percy. Melanie was the only daughter, after all, and it could well have become the kind of sterling bric-a-brac that has somebody else's initials on it and just sits on a shelf, slowly gathering dust, gathering patina in terms of tarnish, something else to polish. But for our family, at some point, the cup began to take on additional meaning, additional patina of the invisible kind. More than a wedding gift from the 1880s in Germany, it began to take on additional meaning because of its use. It was used at Sabbath dinners, weddings, bar and bat mitzvahs, funerals. It became the family Kiddush cup. And so this object, this Rococo Revival silver cup with 3 initials on it, went from being a random family heirloom to being something imbued with this much deeper meaning behind it. Now, often when we think about celebration, we think about objects that have these kinds of additional meanings, our mind does turn to silver. Obviously, the stories of a piece of silver are often scratched directly into its surface, as in the case with this object. But I'd like to propose that furniture, too, can reveal a kind of hidden patina. And I'd like to share with you a number of stories from our collection here at Mazda in which the object itself is enhanced because of the history and meaning and lore that goes with it. And then I'd like to conclude by talking a little bit about how you can preserve that kind of patina in your own objects and in your own collection. Now, furniture, I will say, is actually a particularly apt media for this kind of remembrance. After all, furniture marks our lives. The newborn needs a cradle, newlyweds need beds, and the dead need a coffin. And in between are the chests, the desks, the tables, the chairs, all the furniture that combines to make up a lifetime. And so in furniture, in the use of furniture, in the preservation of furniture, and in the passing on of furniture, we find the opportunity for objects to gather this kind of additional patina, this kind of additional surface. Now, in my opinion, there's no better place to begin our story, our look at this kind of patina, than at the very beginning, with this object, the earliest known piece of Southern furniture. It's just behind me here in the gallery, Mazda's court cupboard. This object was likely made in Jamestown, Virginia, in the middle of the 17th century. And here you see Jamestown circled in red on this map. Now, court cupboards, for those who aren't familiar with the form, functioned much like a sideboard did in the 19th century, as a surface in the main entertaining room of the house, a place for showing off valuable ceramics, silver, and other textiles. And this is a comic book drawing from a great exhibition at Colonial Williamsburg in 1999 called Williamsburg When It Was the Wild West. And here you actually see a cartoonist's version of our court cupboard. Now, Mazda's court cupboard certainly has patina in the most literal sense. It's made of 3 kinds of wood: ebonized walnut, oak, and yellow pine. And these 3 kinds of surfaces are sort of unified, not because of a choice by the maker, but because of a combination of things, a combination of a dark wax that's been applied to its surface again and again over the years, giving it this sort of dark Edwardian appearance and kind of unifying its surface, but also just because of age, just because over time the wood has oxidized and aged. Mazda's court cupboard, unlike, say, New England examples, is a little odd in its construction. It's essentially constructed like a chest with a table on top. And you really get a sense of the kind of visible patina of this piece when you look at the protected area underneath the top here. You see where the top is doweled in and where the top yellow pine boards haven't oxidized as much. You actually see this sort of relatively unoxidized, untouched surface. We like to call it almost like the bacon stripe appearance of the yellow pine, this really vivid orangish yellow striping. Now, originally, the cupboard would have looked much more like this protected area than it does today overall. And we're lucky that Ralph Harvard, the great designer and antiquarian and friend of many of ours, many years ago actually did a sketch of the court cupboard as it would likely have looked when it was first made, with its creamy white oak rails and stiles, its vivid yellow, orange, bacon-striped panels, and then finally these deep, dark, ebonized walnut turned elements all across it. Now, a question about this object, obviously, is how do we know it was made in Jamestown or even the South? Now, one obvious answer is, of course, in the woods themselves. The walnut, and in particularly the yellow pine, are woods that we primarily see in the coastal South, sort of north of the Great Dismal Swamp and into the Chesapeake. But even more than that, we know where this was made because we know where it's been for much of its 3+ centuries of use. You see, we know, because of the family it came out of, that it descended mother to daughter from a woman named Mary Percy Hill, I should say, to her great-great-great-granddaughter, Harriet Walker Smith, who left it to her grandson, the first man to own it in more than 2 centuries. And here is a picture of Benjamin B. Smith, the last private owner of the court cupboard. Now, Smith was using the court cupboard on his back porch to store tools and salted hams when it was discovered by the antiques dealers J.L. and Bessie Brockwell in the mid-1920s. Now, the Brockwells, who are very well known as some of the pioneering Southern antiques dealers, knew they had something truly important, truly unique when they found this court cupboard on that back porch in South Hill, Virginia. And so they took it in 1929 to New York City, to the antique show at the Commodore Hotel, in many ways the forerunner to what would become Americana Week in New York. And here's actually a picture of the court cupboard in the Brockwells booth that year. Now, there is just only one other Southern court cupboard known, and it's this example collected by antiquarian Wallace Nutting and said to have been found in a barn about 15 miles from Jamestown. And in fact, Paul Burroughs illustrated both Southern court cupboards in their unrestored state in his 1932 book, Southern Antiques. Alas, the court cupboard failed to sell. And after attempts to place it at both Yale and Williamsburg, it eventually disappeared from view because J.L. and Bessie Brockwell's marriage was on the rocks. And Bessie, knowing the good thing she had, hid it from her husband. In fact, there's a great story about his funeral. And the other woman at the funeral was so distraught that she apparently fell into the open grave, and Bessie just looked at the grave diggers and said, "Start shoveling, boys." Nonetheless, the court cupboard was hidden by Bessie for many years as they wrangled over whose property was whose. But following his death and burial, the cupboard came back onto the market. Now, it hadn't been forgotten, and it particularly hadn't been forgotten by this man, Frank L. Horden, who, with his mother Theo Tolliver, founded Mazda. Before the Second World War, Frank and his mother Theo operated an antiques business in Clarksville, Virginia, in an old family home located sort of just on the I-95 corridor, or what would become the I-95 corridor. Now, Frank and Theo were from Winston-Salem, but because of Theo's second marriage to a man named Jack Tolliver, they had moved to Virginia, and nonetheless, they'd set up this antiques business and were even advertising in places like the magazine Antiques. Following a stint in the Second World War, however, Frank returned home to Winston-Salem, and instead of reestablishing the business in Clarksville, established his own antiques business on 5th Street, the street he'd grown up on here in Winston-Salem. I love this label. This piece guaranteed to be a genuine antique. Now, as I said, Frank never lost sight of this court cupboard. After all, it had been published in Burroughs. It had figured prominently in the 1952, but would figure prominently in the 1952 antique show. But one day in 1947, into his antique shop in Winston-Salem walked Bessie Brockwell, and Frank began the negotiating to buy the cupboard. In fact, there's a story that Frank Horden eventually talked her down to $2,500 plus 10% of whatever he would sell in the shop that day, which turned out to be a very light day. Apparently, he only sold a single piece of pressed glass that day. But nonetheless, the court cupboard was his. And in fact, this image, I love this image. This is Frank Horden posing next to his court cupboard for the Winston-Salem newspaper after he acquired it. 6 years later, or 5 years later, I should say, Frank lent the court cupboard for the seminal exhibition, Furniture of the Old South, at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. This is its tag. And when Mesda opened in 1965, the court cupboard would have pride of place in the center of the museum's 17th century room. Now, while the court cupboard, of course, is undoubtedly important for what it shows us about early Southern furniture, what makes it particularly important, particularly valuable, particularly useful for our study isn't so much just its physical presence, but is that kind of invisible patina, that story that goes with it, both in terms of Frank's attempt to acquire it, the Brockwell's purchase of it, but probably more importantly than anything, the fact that Benjamin B. Smith, its last owner, knew enough to write down its history, to record where it had been and how it had eventually gotten to him. Because of that history, we're able to look far more deeply at 17th century Virginia furniture making than we would have been able to otherwise. And while the physical evidence on this object has yet to be fully explored, it's this invisible evidence that has taken us a great distance in understanding the kinds of objects likely made in Jamestown when it was still the capital of Virginia during much of the 17th century. Now, Mesda's court cupboard is undoubtedly both iconic and rare. It is, after all, one of just a small handful, perhaps a dozen, surviving 17th century Southern objects. But in a way, this small baluster, about that large, is equally rare. Now, while the court cupboard has this sort of dramatic and usable presence because it's complete, the baluster is a fragment that could easily be overlooked. But the documentary history contained on the label on this object actually helps us to unlock important stories about 17th century Virginia ecclesiastical architecture. Pasted on to this oak baluster is a small label that says, quote, "Banister from the chancel of an ancient church near Smithfield, Isle of Wight County, Virginia, made in England, sick in error, in 1631, obtained at the above church, said to be the second erected in Virginia, by Elisha and Benham of New Haven, Connecticut, and by him presented to the Connecticut Historical Society by J.W. Barber, August 1845. I love this label. Not only because of everything it says, including the idea that it was apparently made in England, which we are pretty certain it was not, but also because the idea of actually removing something from a church, labeling the fact that you removed it, and then giving it to another nonprofit, I just think there's a lot to that story. What we do know is that this oak baluster likely formed part of either a chancel rail or possibly a rood screen at St. Luke's Church in Isle of Wight County, Virginia. And it's one of only about 4 surviving pieces of woodwork from the interior of the church that survive today. And the others, I should note, survive in situ in the church itself. The church itself still stands, as I said, near present-day Smithfield, Virginia. I'll add that it's well worth a visit, as we did just last month with the 2021 MESDA Summer Institute Fellows. It really is an incredible and remarkable church and an incredibly rare survival. One of 3, possibly 4 17th century brick structures that survive in whole or in part in Virginia. Without a doubt, St. Luke's is the earliest surviving intact church in Virginia. And for many years, the structure was assumed to date to 1632. Like most Anglican churches in Virginia, St. Luke's fell into disrepair following the American Revolution, when Anglicanism ceased to be the official state-supported religion in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And of course, this is a history that is recounted by our sticky-fingered antiquarian, that the church had fallen into ruin and disrepair, and that our antiquarian friend had chosen to take a small souvenir home with him to Connecticut. How did it end up at MESDA? Well, in 1984, the Connecticut Historical Society returned the baluster to the South as a gift to MESDA. This is a great newspaper image celebrating its return. And I should also recognize, I think, a friend of many of ours, Bob Trent, for his role in seeing the baluster returned to MESDA. Now, this surviving baluster became a key piece of evidence in the history of the church roughly a decade ago. As I said, for many years, it was assumed the church dated to 1632, and this was based on a particular reading of the church's history and the history of the parish. But in 2008, the baluster, in addition to the other surviving wooden elements of the church, were subjected to non-invasive dendrochronological study as part of a major reevaluation of the church and its history. And for those who aren't familiar with dendrochronology, dendrochronology is the technique by which you read the date of an object by tree rings. And so traditionally, you actually drill a core sample into a beam, ideally one that has a waney or barky edge. You see the pattern left by the tree rings over time, and using control samples, you're able to estimate when a tree was felled. Now, turned wood, of course, doesn't have that kind of barky edge, nor would we want somebody to drill inside of our baluster. But there are now techniques that allow you to take an object like the baluster and actually, using photographic techniques, recreate the structure of the tree rings and come to a date. Not the exact date when the tree was felled, but at least a set of date ranges for when the tree was still growing. This evidence from our baluster, the other pieces of the church, as well as documentary evidence, helped us and helped the church to reevaluate their building and securely date it to the 1680s, placing it into a better conversation with the few other surviving 17th century Virginia ecclesiastical structures, but also clearly establishing that while it didn't date to 1632, it was nonetheless still very clearly a 17th century building. Moreover, objects like this baluster, with a firm provenance and a firm date, allow us to look at other turn furniture and be able to start comparing between furniture in one place and another place, and even over time, we can hope, start defining regional workshops based on the example of this single object, which, but for the pasted label put on it by a Connecticut antiquarian in the 1840s, we wouldn't necessarily have access to. Now, of course, sometimes these kinds of paper labels are less than accurate. Several years ago, we were lucky enough here at Mesda to acquire this table, which was published in Burroughs, Paul Burroughs' book on Southern furniture, and for many years thought to be among the earliest, if not the earliest example of Piedmont, North Carolina furniture. And the North Carolina Piedmont is basically the part of the state from Raleigh west to the Appalachian Mountains. Now, this table came with a label. The label indicates that it came out from the Alexander family at the old Rock House in Mecklenburg County, that's basically Charlotte, and also that this was the very table on which the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence was signed. It's quite the history. Now, the house itself survives. It's called the Hezekiah Alexander House. You can visit it today. And the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, for those who maybe aren't familiar with it, is a 1775 document that supposedly predates the Declaration of Independence of 1776. Now, the exact details or even legitimacy of this claim are worthy of lectures and books in their own right, but suffice to say that the citizens of Mecklenburg, like many elsewhere, following the battles of Lexington and Concord, did indeed almost certainly draft a series of resolves, but these resolves probably fell short of a call for independence from Great Britain. Nonetheless, the date of these resolves is memorialized on North Carolina's state flag. But what about the object itself? What about the table itself? Could this table date to the 1760s or 1770s? Was it made in the Piedmont region of North Carolina? Could the Mecklenburg resolves have been signed on it? Now, some of these questions are essentially unknowable, but the object itself would seem to tell a different kind of story. To start with, you'll notice that the top is connected using a spline joint in which the two leaves actually mate together using a spline, as opposed to, say, a radius joint or even sort of even simpler butt joint. You'll also notice the medial stretcher, but most importantly, take note of how the leaves are supported with these two drawbars, which are just simple pieces of wood that pull out of the frame and hold it up. Now, this table has had a number of pretty significant repairs over the years, but it's very clear from our close examination that it has always been a drawbar table. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if this is a kind of table support that you're relatively unfamiliar with. We were incredibly unfamiliar with it too when we began to look at this table. And it's because most often we see this kind of support technique with Dutch examples associated with New York. We do not, generally speaking, see drawbar tables in the Piedmont of North Carolina. And this, combined with the spline top, suggests that, in fact, this table was likely made before there were white Anglo settlers in Piedmont, North Carolina. So where did the Alexander family come from? And might that history explain why this table looks the way it does? Well, the Alexanders were part of an early Scotch-Irish community in Cecil County, Maryland. And I've circled where Cecil County here is on this map. Now, this part of Maryland in the early 18th century was notable for its diverse population, including Dutch and French Reformed Protestants, Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, of course, as well as British Anglicans and Quakers. Among the most important people in this community was Augustine Hermann, a Bohemian who had spent much of his life in New York working with Dutch merchants out of Amsterdam. Now, and Hermann, I should add, is the maker of this map of Chesapeake I've been using. Hermann lived at a place he called Bohemia Manor. in the 1680s, land he got in return for really doing this map, showing clearly where Maryland and Virginia were, but also sort of pulling together into one place all of the diverse knowledge about the Chesapeake Bay's cartography. And I encourage you, if you would like to learn more about this map, check out Professor Christian Coates' book, Biography of a Map, about the Herman map of Maryland and Virginia. Now, Herman in the 1680s gave several thousand acres of his estate to the Dutch Protestant sect, the Labadists, and roughly 100 settlers also arrived in the Cecil County area from New York and the Netherlands. And if you just look at the names of the settlers in this place, in this time, you find Dutch and French surnames like Bayard, de la Montagne, Sluiter, and Van Bibber, names that are much more familiar with in, say, the Hudson River Valley than you would be in Maryland. Now, the Scotch-Irish Alexander family lived in and amongst these continental European settlers who brought with them these continental European forms. Hezekiah Alexander's maternal grandfather, for example, John McNitt, lived on the north side of Back Creek, directly opposite Bohemia Manor, and his Cecil County estate records include economic transactions with people like Henry Volkerberg, Isaac Van Bibber, and Matthias van der Hayden. In essence, what we're seeing is an echo of the same communities we see in Dutch New York, but now replicated in the Chesapeake, which I should also add was a site of major Dutch trade during much of the 17th century. In the 1750s and the 1760s, Hezekiah Alexander joined his brother, Ezekiel, and John McNitt Alexander, as well as his sister, Jemima, and numerous cousins, in sort of a mass migration across Maryland, down the Great Wagon Road, and into what is now Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. Again, essentially the Charlotte metro area. There, the families helped establish numerous Presbyterian churches, became political leaders in the region's Scotch-Irish community, and in 1774, built the two-story stone house that survives today. Because they were involved in politics, because they were staunchly pro-American during the Revolutionary War, it's certainly possible that this table witnessed many of the events leading up to the Revolution, though I think we have to stop short of claiming that the Mecklenburg Resolves, real or not, were signed on it. Nonetheless, while the history that came with the table is important, by looking at the table itself, the history on the note, and other sources, we are able to get a better idea of why this table looks the way it does and how it connects the larger Alexander family story into the Chesapeake and then Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and really ultimately into the 20th century, when its history was recorded as it was purchased by the Haynes family, who owned it when it was published by Paul Burroughs, and from whose descendants we were very graciously able to acquire it from ESDA. Now, so far, these labels have been placed on objects by third parties. The next object, however, speaks to a very close kind of association between craftsman and client. This Pembroke table was made by the Maryland cabinet maker John Shaw during the 1790s. It's one of his best examples, I believe, with the incredible figured mahogany, the inlay on both the top and the legs, and then just sort of the beautiful shaped top as well. Now, John Shaw was born in Glasgow, Scotland in 1745 and was working here in Annapolis, Maryland. I've circled it on the map by 1768. He really was the sort of, he really for the next quarter century or more becomes the go-to cabinet maker in Maryland's capital. During the Revolution, He was appointed the armorer of the state of Maryland. And because of Shaw's close association with the state of Maryland, both during the Revolution and afterwards, many objects from his shop survive with either documentation surrounding their commission or even their original paper labels. For example, this chair on the left, which is actually here in the gallery with me, was part of a whole set of armchairs made for Maryland's state senate. And the desk and bookcase on the right is virtually identical to an example in the White House collection with this paper label on it. But I have to believe that among his marked and signed works, probably the most poignant is this Pembroke table. And that's because it's marked by his daughter, Mary. In 1777, Shaw married Elizabeth Wellstead Pratt, and the couple had 5 sons and 2 daughters. And when she died, when Elizabeth Pratt died, he marries a second time and has 1 more daughter. Of his 3 daughters, one, Mary, chose to make this table her own, labeling it not just as an example of her father's work, but really as the connection between father and daughter, something that was cherished and maintained and now resides at Mesda, a key cornerstone of Shaw's work in Annapolis in the neoclassical style. This table has a similar story about a craftsman father and a family member, his wife, and then their children. This table was probably made for Anne Bank Adams around the time of her marriage to Thomas J. Maxwell in Elbert County, Georgia, in May of 1831. And this map shows you where Elbert County is, right along the Savannah River. The table descended to their daughter, Julia Ann Norman, and then to her daughter, and then was purchased from that estate by Mr. and Mrs. William Griffin in 1981. And for those who follow Southern decorative arts, the Griffins were some of the earliest and most important Georgia collectors in the second half of the 20th century. We were fortunate at Mesda to be able to acquire this table at the sale of their estate, making Mesda only the second non-family member to own this table. Now, family tradition had always said that it was made by Thomas Maxwell, who married Anne in 1831. And in fact, family history follows that up. In 1953, for example, Maxwell's granddaughter, Quilly Norman, recalled, and I quote, "Grandpa was a cabinet maker as well as a farmer. When his children married, there was a reserve of things he had made. It must have been that he considered it part of his duty to have some of his handiwork in their hope chests. Mother had a chest, 5 chairs, a wardrobe, a small table, probably this small table, and a rolling pin." This piece descended in the family, and as I said, is probably the small table referred to by the maker's granddaughter. But do we know that Thomas Maxwell was really a cabinet maker? Here's where documentary evidence from other sources can be critical in looking at these kinds of claims and in sort of validating this kind of glossy historical patina. When Thomas J. Maxwell died in 1869, his estate contained, among other things, $25 worth of mechanical shop tools and $2 worth of birch plank. And the birch plank, I think, is really key here, because while birch is not a common wood in most places, it is very common as a show wood in Georgia furniture. Sometimes we'll even refer to birch as Southern satinwood, because properly treated, it can actually get that kind of satinwood-like surface. Additional evidence comes when we look at his grandfather, Maxwell's grandfather, Jacob Higginbotham, whose Elbert County estate sale, dated May 5th, 1838, lists, among other things, 1 lot of carpenter's tools, a turning lathe, chisels and gouges, a square, jointer, jack, smoothing and foreplanes, and walnut plank. All of this would seem to provide the evidence that Thomas Maxwell certainly could have made this table for his wife, and that this table because of that history, would have been among the objects the family wanted to keep and pass down, or, in the words of his granddaughter, a piece of his handiwork to put in their hope chests. Another object in our collection that has patina in many different ways is this blanket chest. Now, this object is the earliest dated piece of Georgia furniture. It carries the initials MC and is dated 1839. It was made in 1839 for 16-year-old Mary Ann Cronick, who lived in Walton County, Georgia. Mary was the daughter of John Simeon Cronick and Jane Pike Cronick. Mary's family story echoes that of many settlers with German-speaking origins in the lower southern Piedmont. They migrated to Georgia from the Orangeburg district of South Carolina, having originally arrived in Charleston in 1752, and having been part of that community early on. You can see Charleston on the coast, then Orangeburg, where a number of early German-speaking settlers put down roots. And then in the 19th century, there's this continued migration west into Georgia. And in fact, when you look closely at this chest and its decoration, you can actually find other examples from the Orangeburg region, as well as from upstate South Carolina, that would seem to mimic some of these decorative features, suggesting a sort of cultural continuity among these German-speaking immigrant communities. In 1846, Mary married Anderson, Harris, and Titshaw. The couple had 7 children, and then in 1882 divorced. Following Mary's death, the chest would become a treasured family heirloom for 5 generations, descending to her son, her grandson, and then finally her great-granddaughter, and then to her great-great-granddaughter, the last person in the family to own this object. Correspondence with the chest's last family owner recorded, and I quote, "How ultimately precious it has been one generation after another." And she recalled the day they moved, and it was raining, and that her mother, quote, "moved from the old homestead, and Mama wrapped the chest up as if it were me on the back of the old International pickup truck. She rode on the back with an old piece of plastic covering it, along with all of the quilts she could possibly find." The family also recorded all the precious things the chest had once held: the family Bible, ration coupons, quilts, tools, and other family keepsakes. It had, in essence, become a container for memory, a container for what was really important to the family. When it was acquired out of the family a number of years ago, one of the things the new owner was able to promise was that the chest would be taken care of and the chest would be restored and brought back. You can see it suffered through years and years of sort of protective wax coatings, as well as just life. But this is what the chest looks like today, thanks to the hard work of paint conservator Andy Compton. And I can remember when the owner of the chest at the time actually called the former owner in the family and shared with her the pictures of the chest restored. And you could just hear the amount of emotion on the other end of the phone line when that happened. This chest is now part of Mesda's collection, and we are only the second non-family member to care for it, and to care for not only the sort of visible patina on top of it, the sort of surface that's now protected and conserved and maintained, but also the emotional patina, the historical patina, the family patina that really brings additional meaning to this object, that made this object something important and worthy of being saved for so many generations in the family, and made it something that we were eager to add to our collection, our community's collection here at the museum. So what lessons can we draw from these 6 examples when we think about objects and this idea of an invisible patina that at times simply lends added layers of meaning and connection, but at times can also add a great deal of monetary value, as in when it takes an object that would otherwise sort of not have a direct connection to time and place and space and put it back in there. I think we can gain a few lessons that might be applicable as we think about our own collections and the fact that our collections contain objects for which we are just caretakers because they will ultimately be passed on to future generations. I think the number one thing we can take as advice from this is that if you know something about an object, you should write it down. And you should write it down and place it with that object so that others have the opportunity to have that same amount of knowledge you do. In the case of this dressing table made by the cabinet maker Robert Walker in the Fredericksburg area of Virginia, that takes the form of a detailed label that indicates the 3 or 4 generations of owners, which then gave us the ability at the museum to really look closely at the object, think about where it had been, and ultimately link it back to its original location and a likely maker. And here you see, and it's sort of faded, so I've had to work with the images a little bit, but how this piece descended from Mary Frances Lindsay Durrett to Sarah Lindsay Durrett Goodman to Mary Frances Goodman. And the key in this object's case was our being able to take this information, push it back one more generation, and then actually the ability to link it with cabinet maker Robert Walker. The other advice I have is that you should use an object. Patina is not something that is built up overnight. It takes time, but patina is also something that can be lost in an instant. The best way for your objects to gain this kind of additional historical gloss, this additional meaning in patina, is for them to continue to be important parts of your daily life. Just as my family's Kiddush cup continues to be used regularly at family celebrations, so too should your tables and chairs and desks and silver and textiles continue to be used for the purposes they were made for. This doesn't mean that we should be irresponsible with our objects or that we should do things that would damage them. But at the same time, for an object to have meaning, it needs to see use. And for an object to have memory, it needs to have that memory recorded. And so as you think about your own collections, as we think about the theme of this year's forum, I urge you, write down what you know about your objects and engage your family with your things. Find ways to create new stories to add to your objects and not simply repeat the old stories with them. That's how our objects continue to grow in meaning and in emotional and perhaps even economic value. Thank you so much for listening to this lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to welcoming you to the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts at Old Salem when you're next in North Carolina. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
The Historic New Orleans Collection would like to thank Moss Antiques for its long-standing support of the New Orleans Antiques Forum. Located at 411 Royal Street, the shop's expert staff has been specializing in the exceptional for more than a century. Learn more at mossantiques.com.